Hello and welcome to our next video in our series on the events of the 1960s for the Cold War. This short video is going to focus in on events in Czechoslovakia. This is sometimes referred to as the Prague Spring, Prague being the capital city of Czechoslovakia at the time, so please do not get confused if in the exam you hear Czechoslovakia or you see the Prague Spring or you see the Czechoslovakian uprising. They're all synonyms, they all mean the same thing and refer to the events that I'm about to talk to you about. We're talking about Cold War, therefore we're on paper 1, conflict and tension between East and West, 1945 to 72. Let's get started. So, events in Czechoslovakia are very similar to events in Hungary in 1956. We start off with an angry population, we get a new leader, the Soviets invade, the Americans do very little. Let's go into a bit more detail now about why people in Czechoslovakia were angry. So, in 1948, Czechoslovakia became a communist state under Soviet influence and joined the Warsaw Pact. Before this date, so before 1948, Czechoslovakia had been an independent country and it had a strong national identity. So, being brought into the Soviet Union, or at least being brought into under Soviet influence, was challenging for the Czech people because they were used to being more independent and doing things their own way. By 1968, tensions had escalated as demands for greater freedom increased, leading to mass protests. Czech people didn't like the restrictions that were placed on them by the Soviets, so they didn't like the use of the secret police. They didn't like the fact that they were not allowed opposition political parties. They didn't like the fact that the government had taken over the means of production. So, in particular, as I've just said, Czech people disliked their lack of freedoms, but in particular they blamed their leader Novotny, who they felt was controlled by the USSR. Now, sometimes we get mixed up with names, so a way to remember Novotny is that he is Naughty Novotny, because he's the one that the people do not like. Do not write that in your exam. Just write Novotny in your exam, but if you remember, you're getting confused who's who. Naughty Novotny is the original leader of Czechoslovakia who the people don't like. What happens next then? So, in January 1968, Novotny is replaced by Dubček, and he is a liberal reformer. Liberal means he's concerned more with freedom, and reform means he's concerned with change. So he wants to make changes to Czechoslovakia to give the people more freedom. We've got Naughty Novotny, who the people don't like. On the other hand, we've got decent Dubček, who is popular with the Czech population. He calls for socialism with a human face. So he's trying to make communism more manageable for the people. So, for example, he wants to decentralise the economy, take it out of the government's hands, give people a bit more private ownership. He wants to legalise opposition parties and he wants to expand freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Dubček, however, did not call for Czechoslovakia to leave the Warsaw Pact. Dubček looked back to 1956 in Hungary, when Nagy had asked to leave the Warsaw Pact, and he'd seen what had happened, the Soviet invasion, the death of 30,000 Hungarians. So Dubček does not make the same mistake. He calls for change, he calls for socialism with a human face, but he does not want to leave the Warsaw Pact. Because of this, when the Soviets invade, which they do, it's not a violent invasion. So although on the 21st of August 1965, 500,000 Soviet troops invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the reforms and stop other Soviet countries from doing the same, it's peaceful. Czechoslovakians protested against this, but they did not use violence. There was one death in the Prague Spring, and that was a man called Jan Palach, who self-immolated. He set himself on fire in protest, but there were no deaths from the Soviet troops firing on the protesters or vice versa. The Soviet, though, in their invasion, they don't want Dubček's reforms to go ahead, and they replace him with Gustav Husak, who reinstates strict Soviet-style control. So the way Czechoslovakia is being run, it just goes back to how it was under Novotny. How did this all impact tension? It leads to something called the Brezhnev Doctrine. Brezhnev is the leader of the Soviet Union after Khrushchev, who was in charge during the Czechoslovakian uprising. And he puts forward this doctrine, this kind of way of thinking and the way that the Soviet Union is going to act in the future. And this declares that it's the Soviet Union's right to intervene in any socialist country moving away from communism. So if any of the members of the Soviet bloc or of the Warsaw Pact try to do similar reforms, Brezhnev is saying, I will invade, I will put a stop to it. This strains East-West relations because it shows the lengths that the Soviets are willing to go to keep control of the communist bloc. However, it doesn't have a massive effect on tension because whilst America condemned the action, they avoid any direct intervention. They don't get involved. They think, Czechoslovakia, this is in the Soviet sphere of influence, we're not sending troops there. And they're wary of escalating Cold War tensions at this time. The invasion, though, it does do damage for the Soviets because it reveals cracks within the Eastern Bloc, and this heightened long-term resentment of the Soviet Union. So, for example, Albania, a country that was in the Warsaw Pact, they see the Soviet invasion and they withdraw. So the Czechoslovakian uprising does damage the Soviet Union in this way. Nice one. That is the Czechoslovakian uprising, aka the Prague Spring of 1968. We've got the key knowledge we need there. Now it's time to embed it in our long-term memory by doing some retrieval. Do the quiz, have a go at a past question, do some look cover test check, and then check you've got your answer right. I'll see you on the next video. Goodbye.